Oh boy, it's the big one. It's the top 16 decks from the North American Championships. We're also going to look at the bracket. We're going to look at all of the individual decks. And I'm also going to take a look at my meta report I did a week ago and see if I've done a good job or if I suck at my job. Let's find out, shall we? Big thank you to Card Market for sponsoring the stream. Best place to buy singles in Europe. This is the meta share of day one. So how did you qualify for this event? You had to finish top 16 in one of the North American Challenge events, which there were 6 of, or you had to win your last chance qualifier. Last chance qualifiers are 32-player tournaments, best of 3, and you have to win. So that's how you qualified for this event. Slightly more players in this one than Europe because there was more events in North America. Interesting to note, the Swiss was only 7 rounds in a 2-game format. I personally don't think that's enough. I would like to see in future events a few more games in Swiss. And that's based off me speaking with Frank Carsten, who of course won Lille. He was a bit disappointed that Europe was only 7 rounds as well. The 2-game format I personally love, but you don't have as much Lorcana to play as you do in a best of 3. So I personally feel like 7 rounds for 126 players on a 2-game format, I think it should have been closer to 10 rounds personally. But let me know in the comments if you agree with that and your thoughts. It's definitely interesting. Amber Amethyst with 2 players playing it, I think is awesome to see. We saw one of those on stream and it was a Mufasa deck, not a hyper aggro deck. Amber Emerald, we saw one of the decks on stream, which is You Have Forgotten Me and Diablo, as you'd expect. But I also heard murmurs that there was a Amber Emerald hyper aggro deck in there as well. Amethyst Emerald with only 7 players. Amethyst Emerald tends to be significantly more popular in Europe. But if you look at Amethyst Emerald, it seems like a pretty good meta pick with Ruby Sapphire being the top represented deck. Sapphire Steel with 7 players, more than you might expect. I don't believe any Sapphire Steel players made the top cut. Emerald Steel with 8 players. Emerald Steel does have a player in the top cut, which is Zan Syed. Wonderland, or Wonderland as I should call him, finished 17th, so just bubbled out on Emerald Steel. So it almost had a really good conversion rate. 2 out of 8 players making the top 17. Of course, it's only the top 16, though, that progressed into day 2. Amethyst Sapphire, probably the one that's going to catch most people's eyes, and it is the first decks we're going to be looking at. Actually, it's the second. But Amethyst Sapphire, really, really awesome to see it with 10 players, and it has got 2 decks into the top 16. A lot of people were surprised that I talked up Amethyst Sapphire so highly in my meta report video last week, but the reason this deck is great is it's great in Sapphire and Amethyst mirrors. It's arguably the best Amethyst deck for mirror matchups. It does struggle a little bit into Ruby Sapphire, but the reason it's so good in Amethyst mirrors is because of that Tipo or Sail the Azurite Sea on turn 2. That enables you to play Genie on turn 3 and Elsa on turn 4, which even if you're going second in an Amethyst mirror, that means you get to Genie first and Elsa first, which kind of reverses the coin flip in a way and gives you a really good chance of winning Amethyst matchups 2-0. Amethyst Steel with 10%, obviously my favorite deck. It's got 2 decks in the top cut, and I don't like either of the lists. I think they're going to really struggle in day 2, but we're going to talk about that when we get to them, and we are going to do my bracket prediction. Ruby Amethyst with a big representation and was the worst performing deck by a distance, which I'm also kind of unsurprised about. I almost put Ruby Amethyst in the B tier in my meta report, but the deck that did make it through is so innovative, and it was made by Ed, who of course won a Lorcana challenge. He's been on the channel when I was in California. Great player, incredible innovator. In my opinion, I'm going to have to put him down as the best deck builder in Disney Lorcana after this weekend. I think he's secured his space as the best deck builder in the game with the list he's got. You're going to love it. It's so, so spicy. Amber Steel with a 18% representation. There's 2 versions of Amber Steel that have made the top cut, that Aerial Whole New World version and the version that plays Doc. And unsurprisingly for me, Ruby Sapphire, the most represented deck at an event like this. Ruby Sapphire is a deck which is best in the top players' hands, and it's a deck which the very best players really like playing. If I was to come into a tournament like this, my strategy personally would be build a deck which can 2-0 Ruby Sapphire quite consistently and then work the rest out from there. But it doesn't seem like many people share my opinion on that. That's why I put Ruby Sapphire B tier. Maybe that was a mistake. Let's talk about that as we look through what made the top cut. And here you can see the bracket. Let's have a look. We are going to do a whole bracket prediction. We've got Morgan on Amethyst Emerald. I believe he's the top seed against Philip on Ruby Sapphire. We've got Joseph Quigley on Amethyst Sapphire up against Zan Syed on Emerald Steel. That's going to be a really fascinating matchup. I would wager that Joseph might struggle a little bit. You don't have a ton of ways of dealing with Diablo, but interestingly, you've got that ability to go Tipo, which means Elsa on 4 to deal with Diablo potentially. We've got Edmund Chi, who I just mentioned, on Ruby Amethyst. That's going to be a fascinating one. As I mentioned, Amethyst Sapphire, usually favored in these Amethyst mirrors. Ed is the highest seed, and his list is so innovative. Hamza, who is the guy that's known for playing like 72 cards or something crazy, has made it, is in a Ruby Sapphire mirror match up against Pierre. And then on the other side of the bracket, we've got Sean on Ruby Sapphire up against Zach Bivens. Great to see Zach making the top 16. Definitely a top contender for best player in the game right now. And he's on Amethyst Steel, which I'm happy to see. I think he's going to really struggle. I think he's going to lose 2-0. I'm sorry, Zach. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. Kurt on Amber Steel up against Patrick on Amethyst Steel. That's a very interesting matchup. I'm excited to see how that one goes. And then the final 2 games are Ruby Sapphire versus Amber Steel Songs. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a look at all of the deck lists. I'm then going to do a bracket prediction. The top pinned comment is going to tell you the final placements of this tournament. At the time of recording, it's Sunday morning. We've just got the deck lists. It's not up yet. So 6 decks of Ruby Sapphire, 3 of Amber Steel, 2 Amethyst Sapphire, 2 Amethyst Steel, 1 Emerald Amethyst, 1 Emerald Steel, 1 Ruby Amethyst. So if we look at these numbers compared with the total metagame share, Ruby Sapphire had 32 players in the tournament, or 32% in the tournament, and 37% of the top cut is Ruby Sapphire. So Ruby Sapphire, despite having a very heavy representation, slightly overperforming, which is very, very interesting to see. Amber Steel Songs with 18% making the top cut, and it was 18% that played it in the tournament, so absolutely dead on. We've got, oh, that's the wrong tab, sorry about that. We've got Sapphire Amethyst with 12% of the top cut, and of course Amethyst Sapphire with only 8% of the meta share. So Amethyst Sapphire, one of the best performers there we've seen so far. Then you've got Amethyst Steel with 12% of the top cut, and it was 10%, I think, of the total meta share. Then you've got Emerald Amethyst with 6% of the top cut, and it was 6% of the meta share. And you've got Emerald Steel with 6%, and it was 6%. This is crazy, isn't it? Wow. And you've got Ruby Amethyst with 6%, and it was 12%. So Ruby Amethyst, the biggest loser by far on day one. I suppose technically Sapphire Steel actually the biggest loser, and then Amber Emerald, and then Amber Amethyst, and then Ruby Amethyst, technically in terms of percentage. But Ruby Amethyst, the 3rd most represented deck, but only making it through 1 game into the top cut. But it's really interesting, the rest of the numbers there, very similar to the amount of representation in there, which is really interesting. Worth noting, again, this comes back to my point earlier in the video, with 7 rounds of 2-game format, there are going to be so many people that were like an absolute inch away. So it would be really interesting, for example, in the future to compare these numbers with, say, the top 32 players, right? Because the difference between finishing 16th and 32nd in a 7-round 2-game format with this many players is so small. The margins are absolutely slim. For context, my friend Reese, who finishes the top seed in Europe, he was going into his last game where a loss would have meant that he didn't make the top 16, but the win meant that he was the top seed. So that is how tight it is in these tournaments. So definitely take a lot of these numbers with a pinch of salt. But let's start off with the deck I've been hyping up, the deck I've been really excited to talk about. It's Edmund Chi, and he's playing Chernobog's followers, Diablo and Magic Broom. Well, that is very interesting indeed. He's got all 3 of these 1-drops that you guys know I love so much. And I'm really happy to see that. I think one thing that Ruby Amethyst has made a mistake with in the past is it's been too conservative with the amount of 1-drops. If we go back like 2 sets, there was times where people were just playing 4 Chernobogs and no Magic Brooms. Now, the reason you really need some 1-drops, and I'm sure the reason that Ed has gone for a lot of 1-drops, is your turn 2 plays are only Flynn Rider and Snake. So if you don't draw Flynn Rider and you don't draw a 1-drop, you cannot play your Snake, and that means you're not going to play a card until turn 3, which means you're going to lose so many games. So Ed has gone safety first by playing an abundance of 1-drops. This Diablo is kind of the one that I think is the most, like, everyone plays Chernobog and everyone plays Broom. The problem with Diablo in Ruby Amethyst is it doesn't give you any board presence, and you still do have a bit of a slower start compared to other decks. We've seen No I'm Not Kendall play the Olaf in this slot, which I was very surprised by. And I actually tweeted at him saying, like, why are you playing Olaf when Diablo exists? But a thing that Olaf gives you, for example, is up against Amber Steel songs. If they play Cinderella and they remove your Diablo and you don't have that Flynn, you might not have a turn 2. But the Diablo is great into Cinderella anyway, because if they remove your Diablo with a Storm Rage on or Strength, you just draw anyway. And what is good about playing specifically 12 1-drops rather than like 10 is even if you miss the Flynn or your 1-drop gets, like let's say your 1-drop gets removed turn 1 and you don't draw Flynn, well, because you have so many 1-drops, you've got the opportunity to do the Shimiri line, which is the turn 2 double 1-drop. So I actually think by playing 12 1-drops, specifically these 12, I think these are the best 1-drops in the game. Your other 1-drops become better because it opens up the potential of doing that turn 2 double 1-drop play, which with Amethyst is so strong because these cards replace themselves and draw. So I absolutely love the fact that we start off with 12 1-drops, specifically these kind. But if you're playing these 12 1-drops, that is 4 1-drops more than a lot of other decks play. How are you fitting these in? And the rest of the deck is absolutely fascinating. Okay, Flynn Rider, Snake, Fox, Crab, Sisu. Nothing to see here so far. It's exactly what you'd expect, right? Only 2 crabs. I think 2 is a good number. But then we start getting interesting. Okay, 4 goats, 4 rabbits. Not that surprising. But where on earth are the genies, mate? Where are the genies? Well, they're not even in the deck, and there's no Elsa in here either. So if you're a Ruby Amethyst player that's not got their hands on genies because they're so expensive, well, Ed has just done you a big favor because he's telling you don't even need the genies, mate. Remember, he is the only Ruby Amethyst player that's made it through to day 2 despite it being the 3rd most represented list. So why on earth is Ed not playing genies? And it probably comes down to the fact that Ruby Amethyst is just struggling a little bit in the mirror matchups, or not necessarily struggling in the mirror matchups, but in a 2-game format, it's so important to get those 2-0 victories. And if you're playing against other Amethyst decks, you just have a slower start than them as Ruby Amethyst. And if they go Genie, you go Genie, they go Elsa, you go Elsa, you're just at a disadvantage. So what Ed is saying instead, and this is particularly interesting against the Blurple decks, right? Because a big reason Blurple is considered an option for Amethyst is that you get that Elsa and that Genie through earlier. Well, Ed suddenly, against those Blurple decks, isn't going to care about that as much as other players would, because he doesn't even bother with the Genie. The thing is with Genie being uninkable is that if you're going second, by the time you get to turn 4, you kind of just have to play it, even if your opponent's already developed a Genie, if they've already developed an Elsa. So Ed is completely removing the Genie Wars from the equation, which, if that suits any Amethyst deck, it's got to be Ruby Amethyst, because Ruby Amethyst has the best late game. So he's just going for consistent card draw and consistent points on turn 4 with the rabbit and the goat. He also has the brawls, of course, which he could brawl on turn 4. Like, for example, if his opponent opens up Genie and then he's going second, his turn 4 could be a brawl and a 1-drop because he plays so many of them. And the 1-drops, again, in this deck are so good because they just gain 1 lore and then they replace themselves, which is applying pressure. And also, he's got 4 copies of the library with all these 1-drops. Oh my goodness, Ed, he's absolutely cooking. I mean, if you look at the library and all these 1-drops, we always thought that the library was going to be mega broken with all these 1-drops, but it's just not caught on. And Ed's playing 4 of them, which in turn also makes these other 1-cost characters better. I told you it was innovative. Like, often you see Ruby Amethyst and you're like, yeah, okay, he's got a couple cards different. He's playing 4 Lady Tremaines, everybody. And no Madame Medusas. 4 Lady Tremaines. That is outrageous, Ed. And what's fascinating is, in theory, the more Lady Tremaines you play, the better the other ones become. Because if you just have an onslaught of Lady Tremaines, if you go back to the set 2 meta before Madame Medusa was a card, there's so many Tremaines, right? You play Tremaine, you play Tremaine, you play Tremaine, and you're just slowly whittling away all of your opponent's cards. Also, it works really nicely with the Fox and the Snake, because you can bounce it back and replay it. It also quests for 2, so it can apply a little bit more pressure. It's great in particular against Ruby Sapphire as well. Ruby Sapphire, especially in the closed decklist format of the day 1. Day 2 is open deck lists, but day 1 was closed deck lists, so their opponent sees 2 Tremaines. They're not going to be expecting the 3rd, are they? But suddenly Ed's got it. And Tremaine also combines really well with the B prep and the Sisus. So after Ed's cleared the board, he can then play these Lady Tremaines and answer the Tamatoa that his opponents put down or something like that. 2 Sisus. Ed is the man that really innovated to put these legendary Sisus in the Ruby Amethyst decks to begin with. It was his tournament-winning deck he was really the first person to do this, and it's something he's associated with. So this deck from Ed is, honestly, confirmation for me that he is the best deck builder in the game right now. That is my statement. This deck is so damn cool, and the evidence is there. Ruby Amethyst, the 3rd most represented deck, and only 1 player made it through to top cut. I'm rooting for Ed. I think this deck's awesome. He's also a great guy, friend of the channel, great player. I've actually got a video that I recorded. I played against Ed about a month and a half ago, so his list was quite different, and he beat me 2-1. So if you guys would like to see that video still, I could post it. I kind of is collecting dust. Big shout out to Ed. Awesome guy. Awesome deck. Up next, we've got Zan Syed, another awesome guy, and this is the only Emerald Steel deck, and it's a very innovative one as well. Quite a few players were utilizing this same 60 cards, most notably no copies of Beast in this deck, no copies of We Don't Talk About Bruno. So there are 3 Cursed Merfolk as well. This is going to considerably help the matchup against Ruby Sapphire, which of course was represented a lot in the field. Unsurprising to see the Diablos, 3 Calhouns, 2 Docs. Doc is a great card. We saw Wonderland playing 1 copy of Doc in his Seattle winning deck. Zan's gone for 2. Wonderland also had 2 in this one. Go-Go's in there. Only 3 Smee is fascinating. Smee is like a card you look at and you're like, I can't possibly ever cut it. But the thing is, when you're playing Emerald Steel, you need to have an abundance of songs because you have Ursula. You need to have an abundance of discard, but also because you're playing the Muses, the more songs you play, the better. Like songs which are just something like Strike a Good Match, which would never really be a consideration. If you're playing the Muses, is suddenly a serious option. So it's really difficult to fit everything you need in Emerald Steel. You need the discard, you need the songs, and you just need like a curve. So cutting a Smee seems a bit outrageous and cutting an Ursula, but it does make sense. You have to make cuts somewhere. What's really interesting in this deck is the 4 Peats. I was watching Zan on the stream yesterday and I said, I need to have a conversation with Zan and he needs to convince me that Pete is worth it in this deck. And then I watched the game and it was the absolute Pete show. What Zan did was my favorite play of the day, which was he played his Diablo on turn 1. He saw that his opponent had Storm Rage on his removal. And then his turn 2, he didn't shift Diablo. Because what this was doing, it was posing the threat that on turn 3 he could shift Diablo and play Pete the same turn. So what ended up happening is his opponent was forced to use the Storm Rage on the 1-cost Diablo, and then Zan could just, instead of playing the Pete on turn 3, just play the Diablo on turn 3. And then I think Pete came on turn 4, turn 5, and turn 6. Something like that. It was the absolute Pete show in that game. So I'm Still Here is the other really interesting inclusion. Again, it's just another song, which you can sing with Ursula. You can get Muses synergy with. I think that's the most important thing. And it's a song which has some impact and draws you a card. So you gain resist 2 until the start of your next turn. So for example, you can use that on the Smee. You could also use that on Calhoun to challenge something and give her resist 3 for the turn, meaning she's going to stick around. And it's just a song card which cycles, which I think with the Muses is really, really key. And it's also important to note that Zan is on 4 Hypnotize, 4 Sudden Chill as his discard, as well as those 3 Ursulas. So he's not compromising. He's not removing the discard cards. He's got no Lucifer. He's got no Honey Lemon, which I think are 2 cards which you could consider because they're cards which can discard. You can bounce them back with the Muses and replay them. But it's just so hard to fit everything you possibly need in this deck. And what Zan's prioritized here is an abundance of song cards to make sure his Muses is getting great value. And then he's also got some aggressive tools in terms of the Merfolk and the Go-Go as well. Awesome deck list. Zan's a great guy, and even though I don't like Emerald Steel anymore because I kind of just hate Diablo, I think it's nice to see Emerald Steel still competing at the very top. I think Emerald Steel's a much more interesting deck when there's, it's not the most played deck in the meta game, right? Up next, we've got Emerald Amethyst. Only one Emerald Amethyst deck making the top cut, and it is the top seed. So that is quite scary. Emerald Amethyst, of course, a pretty speedy deck, and it is Mo Shamblin, which honestly is the coolest name I've ever heard. Mo Shamblin? That is an awesome name. And when I was watching this deck on stream yesterday, I immediately said it's my favorite deck of the tournament that I'd seen on stream. I hadn't seen Ed's deck. The thing I don't like about this deck, and I would be fascinated to hear Morgan's reasoning, is this Olaf. I'm a bit of an Olaf hater. I was joking with Elmeister recently saying that I'm the president of the Olaf hate club. For me, I would never go near this Olaf when you could play more Brooms and Chernobyls. A big reason you might play Olaf is it's going to be better into Amber Steel songs because they can't go Cinderella Storm Rage on to remove it, and then you could bounce it back with the Snake and then ink it or something. So that's probably the reason for the Olaf. There's so many 1-drops though, so Morgan's going to be looking to do this Shin Miri special with the Pegasus, also being a fascinating inclusion, and there's also 2 copies of the Pegasus Shift. I think the Pegasus 1-drop is arguably the best 1-drop outside of Amethyst. Let me rephrase that. It's the best inkable 1-drop outside of Amethyst, because I think you could make a case for Curse Merfolk, you could make a case for Maleficent 1-drop in my opinion, although I think a lot of people would dispute that. Daisy Duck, but the best inkable 1-drop outside of Amethyst. For me, if you just cut these 2 Olafs, you put in the 4th Broom, you put in the 4th Chernobog's followers, I would be in awe of this deck. That's my only thing I personally don't like. But I'm sure Mo has their reasons for it, and it will be fascinating to hear it. You just wouldn't catch me playing it personally. But what do I know? Just giving you my thoughts on the list. 4 Go-Go's, no surprises there. 2 Sir Hiss is really interesting. Not necessarily a Diablo tech, but we saw it is. It does help deal with Diablo. But Sir Hiss gives you a bit of coverage into Diablo, which in America you can expect to have a decent representation. But also we saw Mo challenging a Maui Half-Shark with the Sir Hiss, and using the Go-Go to gain, I think it was 4 lore at the time, which was really, really amazing. 3 kits, 2 Lyles, not something you always see in these decks, but that's going to really help you in those Amethyst mirrors. 4 Rabbits, 3 Crabs, 3 Prince Philip, great card with Ward and a 3/2 stat line, 3 White Rose, 4 Genie, 4 Goat, 2 Rabbit. Really awesome list, very, very speedy. Most likely his turn 2 is going to be double 1-drop, the Shin Miri special, and I think it's going to be very, very hard to stop Morgan with a list like this when he's the higher seed. Zach Bivens up next, onto Amethyst Steel. And this is where I need to take a sip of my coffee and cry that people disrespect Maleficent 1-drop so much. I love Zach. Zach's a great player, much better player than I am. Great deck builder. He's obviously decided that he doesn't want the Maleficent 1-drop, but the problem with that is for Zach is, as you're going to see in a minute, if we look at the bracket, he's lower seed against Ruby Sapphire. And I think he's got, and listen, I might eat my words, I think he's got no chance. I think he's got absolutely no chance to make it through his top 16 game without that Maleficent 1-drop. There's method to the madness. There's a reason I play the card. So, Maleficent 1-drop, I'm not going to talk about it too much because it's not in the deck, but in my opinion, I'm going to go out and say it is currently the most underrated card in the game. The bounce package just turns these 1-drop cards, which quest for 2, into pretty good cards in my opinion, and it is just a necessary evil to have a chance of beating Ruby Sapphire going second. He's got almost no chance. Genuinely. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Zach is going to be able to get the win out of the bag. I think something just has to go seriously wrong for Ruby Sapphire to lose. But what is this deck going to be great at? Because, of course, the Maleficent 1-drop is going to be bad in other matchups. Let's be very, very clear. There's a reason he's not playing it. He's accepting that, okay, without the Maleficent, he's going to be worse against Ruby Sapphire, but he's going to be better, for example, against Amber Steel songs. Arguably, he might be better against other Amethyst decks, although I'm not necessarily sure I would agree with that. The big reason really to not play the Maleficent 1-drop is instead going for And Then Along Came Zeus and Strength of a Raging Fire as his options, instead of cards like Befuddle and Fire the Cannons. So it's a slower, more methodical version of Amethyst Steel, which is certainly a more mid-range approach. And I think if you're going for like a mid-rangey Amethyst deck, Amethyst Steel makes perfect sense. It's just not personally my belief of the better way to go because of the representation of Ruby Sapphire, right? Calhoun's in there, makes sense. Like, if you're not going for the Fire the Cannons, the Befuddles, you're not going for the Maleficents. Instead, Calhoun on turn 2 is a really good option rather than doing the Shin Miri special, where you go for that turn 2 double 1-drop. So Calhoun, Smee as the most likely turn 2 plays, and then the Snake is in there for the later game, bouncing things back like Pete and Rabbit and whatnot. Lawrence is in there. Lawrence might give him a bit of help against Ruby Sapphire because, of course, it can't be hit by Medusa. It can't be hit very easily by the Sisu either. 3 Crabs, 4 Petes. 4 Pete is great with the Snake. I think Snake plus Pete is pretty crucial in this metagame. It helps you against Emerald Steel. It helps you against Amber Steel because you could play Pete on turn 4, for example, and then you can bounce the Pete back and play the Pete again on turn 5. When you're just playing Pete without the Snake, you could go Pete on turn 4, but then you wouldn't be able to repeat with a Fox. Whereas as soon as you're playing the Snake, I think the Pete becomes considerably better. In a deck like this, Pete, you kind of need more than just one turn of Pete. You kind of need to Pete back to back to back. I think that's the big advantage of playing the Snake in this deck. White Rose, only 2 copies of it. Again, going to be a little bit more of a struggle against Ruby Sapphire with that decision, but he's kind of doubling down on his deck building. And 2 Genies, 4 Goats, 4 Rabbits, 3 Elsa, 4 Strength, 4 Zeus. Zeus is great in the Genie Wars. So what Zach's deck is going to be really good at is going to be really good in Amethyst Mirrors, which obviously make up a big portion of the tournament. I mean, if you look at the overall picture, you've got, you know, a good 12, 32, 40% of the meta, actually 50% of the meta. Half of the meta here is against other Amethyst decks, and only 32% is against Ruby Sapphire. So, to be fair, Zach's got, by going for the deck which is going more into the Amethyst Mirrors instead of the Ruby Sapphire decks, I mean, it makes sense in terms of meta representation when you look at it that way. And the Zeus and the Strength of a Raging Fire are great cards in the Amethyst mirror matchups, because you can deal with your opponent's Genies very, very easily by singing Strength with your 3-drops or singing Zeus with your Goat, Rabbit, or Genie. Like this, the Zeus, Zan Syed said to me, is kind of the money card in the Amethyst mirrors at the moment. It is the best card in the Amethyst mirrors, Zan said to me. So that's why Zach's been able to do so well. But the bad news for him is his deck is just going to get 2-0'd by Ruby Sapphire probably most of the time. He's got a bit of a chance when going first to claw out a victory, but I think going second, he's got near 0 chance of beating a competent Ruby Sapphire player. So I think the run is going to be over for Zach. That's my prediction, but I got my fingers crossed for him. Great guy, and clearly the deck served him super duper well. I'm very biased when it comes to Purple Steel. You guys know me. I like my Maleficent 1-drops. Speaking of Purple Steel without Maleficent 1-drops, the other deck in the top 16 also not playing Maleficent 1-drops, and it's going to be Patrick. He has got all 4 copies of the 3 1-drops I like. He is also going to be looking for Calhoun on turn 2 or Smee on turn 2 most of the time when you're not playing Befuddle and you're not playing Fire the Cannons. Usually it's going to be Calhoun on 2 or Smee on 2 rather than the double 1-drop, but he does of course have that option as well. 3 Crabs, 4 White Rose, so going to be having a slightly better matchup. Fascinating to see there's no into Ruby Sapphire. Fascinating there's no Zeus in this one at all, but instead going for 4 copies of Strength of a Raging Fire. So the difference is in 1 Bell in there. The main difference is in this one, Zach is on 4 copies of Zeus. There's no copies of Zeus here. Zach actually not on Doc at all, but preferring 4 Rabbits and 2 Genies, whereas this one is on no Rabbits but Docs. Of course, if you're playing Zeus, the Rabbit makes more sense than Doc, and if you're not playing Zeus, the Doc makes more sense. So it's very, very fascinating. Personally, which deck do I prefer? I prefer Zach's, actually. I think that like no Doc with Rabbit and Zeus makes a lot more sense than personally this one. I think if you're playing Doc, I would just go for the Maleficent. Of course I would. You guys know that. Whereas I think that Zach's list, there's a reason not to go for the Maleficent. There's a reason not to go for the Doc, which is he's playing Rabbit and Zeus, which is going to be great in the Amethyst mirrors. Whereas this list, I mean, clearly it's a great list. Make no mistake. This list has the Doc. It doesn't have the Zeus, but it still is going to lose to Ruby Sapphire. So I would wager that Zach's deck is better in the Amethyst mirrors than this one, and they both still lose to Ruby Sapphire. So that's why I prefer Zach's list. I think it's just got a more clear goal in the deck builder, which is to 2-0 Amethyst decks, and accept that you're maybe getting a 1-1 against Ruby Sapphire, maybe losing 2-0, and this one is kind of losing to Ruby Sapphire 2-0 most of the time, and it's clearly going to have a good Amethyst mirror matchup, but just not quite as good as Zach's. So that's why I prefer Zach's. I think that the Zeus, if you're going for no Maleficent, I think you go for Rabbits and Zeus. And if you're going for Maleficent, you play Doc and no Zeus. Probably where I'm at with that. But big congratulations to all of these players. I'm obviously just giving you my honest opinions on these decks. Clearly, these guys are great players and great deck builders. I just think it's more interesting to share my genuine opinions, which are not always going to be correct. I just think it makes for better, more interesting content, rather than me just going, oh, this is great, this is awesome. I just give you my honest opinion, because I'm going to be wrong a lot of the time, but it's interesting to talk about. Okay, up next we got Amethyst Sapphire, the one you've been waiting for, and we've got RMB. Big shout out to RMB. On Amethyst Sapphire, we've got 2 decks in the top cut, and RMB, a friend of the channel, great dude. He is on 10 1-drops, 2 Magic Brooms, I would like to see him squeeze in that that third and fourth magic broom. That's my first takeaway. I genuinely believe these are the best cards in the game. I genuinely do. But of course, if you're removing some 1-drops, you get to play a little bit more top end. That's going to be the trade-off. 4 snakes, 4 Tipo, 4 fox. No surprises there. 3 crabs. So instantly, I would try and drop that crab down to 2 to fit in that broom. But what do I know? That's just, the way I'm looking at it. 4 genies, 4 goats, 4 rabbits, 3 bells is a lot of bells, 2 Donald Duck. This is an awesome card. When you play this character, you may put the top card of your deck into your Inkwell. It's like a Mickey Mouse, but it's inkable and it's got bigger stats. And you play it, like, of course, now because you go Tipo or Sail on turn 2, you don't really want to play Mickey Mouse. But like this Donald Duck can come through on turn 4, which means you can then play like your Hades on turn 5, for example, which is really, really cool. There's 4 Elsas, which is no surprise because you're looking to do the Genie Elsa. 3 Hades, 3 Legendary Elsas, 4 Sail, 4 Friends, and 1 Let It Go. So my way of looking at this deck, I love it. I just hate seeing only 2 Magic Brooms. Like for me, that just hurts my heart. I would always try and squeeze in the 4th, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. I just think that the Brooms are the best card in the game almost. I really, really do. So if I was to look at this list and tweak it to fit those 4th brooms in, because that's always the question, right? If I'm saying, I want to play the 4 brooms, how do you actually do it? Probably reduce the crab count to 2 would be my starting point. And then just squeeze out something else as well. I mean, I'm sure that the Donald Duck is performing really, really well for him, but I would maybe look at that. Maybe the Let It Go could go. I don't know. Like, obviously, R&B knows a lot more than I do about this deck, because if I'm just saying, oh, where's the 4th broom? Like, I actually need to come up with an example of what I would get rid of, right? Which is easier said than done. Of course it is. But what's really fascinating about a deck like this is you go one drop on turn 1. On turn 2, you go Sail, and you can play another 1-drop, which is insanely good because these 1-drops replace themselves. It's another reason I would want to play the 4th broom. And then you go Genie on 3, Elsa on 4, Shift Elsa on 5. That is a flipping amazing curve, mate. So cool. So again, these decks are really good at winning the Amethyst mirrors, even when going second, because you get to play Genie first and you get to play Elsa first. And what's great about this color combination is now that you have Sail and Tipo, you have a consistent turn to ramp play. If you play Tipo, you can't play another 1-drop, but if you play Sail, you can. So Sail plus one of these 1-drops is so good, it's literally the best opening in the game. It is the best opening in the game. Interestingly, Lantern in Amber Amethyst is a deck I've looked at a lot in the previous set because you can go Lantern on 2 and play the 1-drop. Very similar to Sail. But of course, Amber Amethyst, while it never caught on, I think it was probably a better Blurple last set. People just didn't know about it. But now that you've got Sail and Tipo, like Sapphire is definitely the better way to go because you have 2 of these ways of ramping up on turn 2. And that's what's enabled this deck to actually be good this set, is it's got that consistent ramp. When you're playing Amethyst, you have like 50 Amethyst cards normally. And it's like, okay, what are the best cards I can pair with Amethyst from each ink color? It's a really interesting experiment. Like if you go Ruby, it's probably Brawl. If you go Sapphire, it's Tipo Sail, right? If you go Amber, it's probably Lantern, in my opinion. Super fascinating, like thought experiment. And yeah, for Sapphire, it's Tipo Sail. That's the reason you play Sapphire with this core of Amethyst cards. So super big shout out to R&B. Let's look at the other list. Is there 4 brooms in this one? There's not. There's also just 10 1-drops, but a slightly different thread with 4 Diablos in this one, 3 Diablos, 3 brooms in this one. And it's pretty similar. 4 crabs. That is slightly different. Finders Keepers as a one-off is really, really awesome to see. This is an Enchanted as well. We also saw them have an Enchanted Elsa because this was on stream. Finders Keepers drawing 3 cards is not a card you can play in most Amethyst decks, but obviously this deck has an abundance of ink. Cutting a rabbit perhaps to fit that compared to R&B also only on 3 rabbits. Excuse me, I've got hiccups. 4 goats, only 1 bell. R&B was on 3. 2 Donalds, 4 Elsa, and 3 McDuck Manor, rounding it out. 2 big Elsas. So very, very similar list, but a few differences. The McDuck Manor being the main thing that Joseph Quigley has. They're also the 8th seed, so or in the top 8 rather. So that's going to help them, having the McDuck mana to just help them going first a bit. Whereas the Bell for R&B, he's really trying to 2-0 those Amethyst mirror matchups. But the McDuck mana, I think, is going to give Joseph a much better chance against Ruby Sapphire. Whereas I think that R&B is probably going to struggle against Ruby Sapphire quite a bit. So I like the look more of Joseph's list. I think the McDuck mana to give you a little bit of better coverage against Ruby Sapphire, and the Finders Keepers as an inclusion are super duper fascinating. But big shout out to both players. Very similar lists. Super duper awesome. And if you're wondering, because Joseph was playing this Enchanted Elsa, how much is Enchanted Elsa worth right now? Well, Card Market, who sponsor the channel, you can see that if you want to pick up a French Elsa, it's about 328 quid. But if you're looking for an English Elsa, you're looking at about £630. That's a pretty good deal, because the next cheapest is 725. So I think someone might, after seeing this video, go ahead and pick that up. Thanks, Card Market, again, for sponsoring. We've got now Amber Steel deck, starting off with Justin, who has this Amber Steel Diggy Diggy Hole, which is inspired by Brennan DeCandio. He has got the 1-drops of Daisy and Cindy, but then suddenly you might struggle for other 1-drops in Amber Steel if you're not playing Robin Hood and you're not shifting a whole new world. So what other 1-drops are actually good in Amber Steel? Well, there's Happy, who is a pretty alright card in his own right. He's not a card I would ever consider playing in Amethyst, because you have so many good 1-drops there, but you do lack that 4th good 1-drop, and Happy provides you with a half decent 1-drop. Particularly when you combine Happy with the 7 Dwarfs Mine. And that is why you start to see Happy and 7 Dwarfs Mine creeping into these decks. It's because Doc is an insane card, 7 Dwarfs Mine is a pretty damn good card, and Happy's not bad at all. So I really like these lists. I think they're super awesome. There's 3 Calhouns, 4 Docs, 4 Lilos, 4 Smee, 4 Piglet, 4 Lawrence, 4 Pete, 3 Pluto, 4 Rapunzel, Big Man, Captain Cranky Head. This card's so good. I think this card is still being slept on by a lot of players. We saw Harlan win the Content Creator Set Champs with it. 3 copies of Gantu is a lot more than you usually see. People have started to play maybe 1 copy, but mate, this card is absurdly strong. And I love to see Justin playing 3 copies of Gantu. Even when I've been building my deck, my Amethyst Steel deck recently, I've been considering going down from 4 Gantus to 3. I don't want to. I just kind of by principle want to play 4 copies of this card, because if you've got a more aggressive version of a deck with Doc, like, this is absolutely popping off. And honestly, this deck is very similar to the Amethyst Steel deck that I'm kind of saying I think is great, like with Maleficent. And maybe this is just a better version of like the aggro Amethyst Steel, because you have Daisy instead of the Maleficent 1-drop. You have Doc. It's very, very similar decks, right? You have Rapunzel for the card draw, you have the 7 Dwarfs Mine for a bit of control. So this deck is in many ways very, very similar to the Amethyst Steel setup that I like, with the more aggressive setup. Super awesome to see Captain Crankyhead. And Captain Crankyhead currently is £16 on Card Market. Thanks again, Card Market. I do appreciate you. This one, Amber Steel, is a more traditional aerial deck from Sean. He has the Queen and 4 copies of both as the shift option. I think I like the Queen as the shift option. It's my personal favourite if I'm playing a whole new world, because you can shift in on turn 2, which means that you can often sing a whole new world before your Emerald opponent can even play the Ursula. 1 copy of Lilo only is interesting. Of course, when you're not playing Simba, the Lilo becomes a little bit more clunky. Smee, 3 Ursulas, 4 Ariel, and 4 Gaston. Gaston is great in these decks because against the Ruby decks, playing Ariel is just giving your opponent the opportunity to brawl your Singer, and it really sets you back. Whereas Gaston is very difficult for Ruby decks to deal with on turn 3. So Gaston, 3 copies is great to see. 3 Lawrence, 4 Pete, 1 Naveen. I think 1 Naveen is a great number of Naveens because it can just catch your opponent off guard. You never really want 2 Naveens in the same hand. It's a great card off of a whole new world, and it's also a great way to play a whole new world on turn 4 by surprise. 4 Rapunzel, 1 Aerial Sonic Warrior. We saw this card popping off really strong, in particular against the other Amber Steel decks, like the Diggy Diggy Hole setup. The Aerial Sonic Warrior just absolutely cooked in that matchup that we saw on stream. 2 World's Greatest Criminal Minds. These combine very well with the Queen because you can give your opponent extra strength on a character to take it out with the World's Greatest Criminal Mind, and it's also a card which is pretty good into Ruby Sapphire. This deck is probably going to have a bad matchup into Ruby Sapphire though, but Sean's just kind of accepted that. And the last Amber Steel deck is another Diggy Diggy Hole one, and this is the 3rd seed, and it has got some real spice. Very similar until we get onto the John Silver. Only 2 piglets, and John Silver ships Cook. Harlan, who won the Content Creator Set Champs, also played this card, and I spoke to him a little bit about this card because I was like, Harlan, mate, I really like your deck. It's really, really cool, but why on earth are you playing this John Silver? It just seems like a bit weird. And he said, and I quote, John Silver is, and he was playing it, bear in mind, in Sapphire Steel aggro, so a kind of similar deck in a way. He said John Silver is broken good in the right spots. Like for Maui Shark, he gives you another turn of questing, and if you can stall with another, it's so good. The best line is 1-drop, 2-drop, John Silver sings strength. That was his thoughts. He again plays a slightly different deck, Sapphire Steel aggro, but that's why John Silver is making into it here. When you play this character, chosen character can't challenge during their next turn. So really good on the Half Shark in particular. It's going to allow you to quest and stop your opponent being able to challenge with the Half Shark, bringing back Pirate's Life and stopping you get to 20. So John Silver, a bit of a tech card perhaps for that. And then there's 3 copies of Chenpo, the bodyguard. That is super duper spicy. Gantu was kind of the 3 copies in the other deck. This one for Kurt is the Chenpo as an absolute unit of a bodyguard. But look at that. Rapunzel's Tower is so spicy. It is gaining 0 lore. Chosen character gets +3 willpower while here. And it's got 8 willpower itself. And it only costs 1 to move in. So often with dock decks, you kind of reach a point where you run out of resources in hand. You run out of cards in hand. So having locations can be really, really good to just use your resources in that extra way. And Lilo plus Rapunzel's Tower is particularly interesting because you can move your Lilo, which is going to be exerted, into Rapunzel's Tower for 1 ink, and suddenly your Lilo has 5 willpower. That is damn spicy. Also, what's great to note about the locations is with the Seven Dwarfs Mine, when you move into a location, you can't move out of said location unless you have another location. So, what the extra 2 locations will allow Kurt to do on occasion is move his dock from the Seven Dwarfs Mine into Rapunzel's Tower, to then move it back into the Seven Dwarfs Mine to get that 2 damage again. Of course, Seven Dwarfs Mine is when you move a knight in here, deal 2 damage to a character. When you move anything else into here, deal 1 damage. But that's only once per turn. So often you're going to move Doc or Happy in there, but then they're kind of stuck in there, right? But the Rapunzel's Tower just gives you that extra location. Of course, you can flip-flop Doc and Happy in between the Seven Dwarfs Mine, and that would be a preference, but Rapunzel's Tower gives you an extra way of doing it, and really, really cool deck. 3rd seed. Going to be hard to stop. This could be a top contender to win the whole tournament when we do our bracket prediction in a minute. Up next, we got Sean, who is on Ruby Sapphire. So we've got the Ruby Sapphire decks now, which, of course, there's quite a lot of to look at. Ruby Sapphire, I have to say, the deck I know the least about. It's just not my play style. It's just not a deck that I play. So I probably don't have too many strong opinions on the way these decks are set up. For sale, 4 Tipo, I think, is a must. No 1-jumps. 3 Grammar 4 Flaversham. 4 Big Sisu, only 2 B Preps. Alfargo, Ice Blocks, Vision. 2 Pirate's Life. That's Sean's. We've got a lot to look at. And again, I don't have the strongest opinions on Ruby Sapphire decks, so I probably won't talk for as long about these ones. Oh my goodness, what the heck is that? Hello, Prince John Gold Lover. Exert, play an item from your hand or discard with 5 cost or less for free. Wait, really? Wait, really? That's a real card in this deck? Huh? Exert and play an item from your hand or discard. I guess the key is discard, right? You can play a Popsicle from your discard. Wow, that is very, very fascinating. Prince John can also sing How Far I'll Go. Wow, that is honestly, I guess Vitalosphere as well. You pop the Vitalosphere, you exert the Prince John. Is that really worth it? I mean, I am very impressed that it's in the deck, but I struggle to see that it's worth it. But fair play. I've actually got a promo card of this Prince John because it's the card that you get in the Disney Villainous as a promo. Imagine Matthew's playing 2. That is honestly the most surprising card I've seen so far in this top 16. So fair play to Matthew on the Prince John. How spicy is that? Unbelievable. Next, we've got Pierre. Top 16 with Ruby Sapphire. He has got 1 Dime, 2 Ice Blocks, 3 B Preps, 2 Pirate's Life, 1 Hideaway. Alrighty. 1 Medusa. We've got Scott's 2nd seed. Damn, Scott was on a tear. He's got 1 Queen of Hearts, 2 Little Sisus, 3 Talas. He's got the Tamatoas, 1 Hideaway, which we saw come in clutch in his stream game, putting away his opponent's dime. He did an interview and said he really likes Ruby Sapphire mirrors. And great record here. 2nd seed. That is a very, very scary position for Ruby Sapphire to beat. And we've got 2 more to look at. We've got Philippe. Milan? What? 4-3 rush? Oh my goodness. What am I more surprised by? The Prince John or the Milan? Honestly, the Prince John. I'm even more surprised by the Prince John. I mean, a 4-3 rush is kind of interesting. We saw Dinkhang Pham playing Super Goof, which is also a rush character. It's just an inkable rush character. Like, I think you'd rather play the Milan than the Super Goof in this deck for just raw stats. But I imagine the Dinkhang Pham had the Super Goof over Milan because it's inkable, not necessarily because of the lore gain, although that is definitely a benefit of Super Goof. But of course, with this deck, you can go Tipo or Sail on 2, which opens up the potential to play this Milan on 3. It's interesting that they go for the Milan with the 4 strength over, for example, the Penelope, who's like a 3-3 evasive. Very, very cool to see Milan in there as a surprise option, right? It's kind of similar to Queen of Hearts. Okay, it's uninkable. I actually quite like the idea of that, especially in a closed decklist format like Day 1 was. I'm sure this Milan caught at least 1 player off guard. Ruby Chromicon, I think, is a really cool card to see in there as well as a 1x copy. Chosen character gets +1 strength this turn. Only 3 brawls, 1 of the Shield of Virtue, and 4 McDuck manners. That's a lot of manners, mate, which is going to help when you're going first in particular. And finally, last but not least, we've got Hamza, who Hamza is known for playing an absurd amount of cards. Let's count them, shall we? 4, 7, 10, 14, 17, 19, 22, 23, 26, 33, 32... 35, almost. 39, 43, 47, 51, 53, 56, 59, and we've still not stopped. 63, 64, 66. I might have miscounted, but it's around 66 cards, which is honestly less than I thought he had. Fair play. I thought it was more like 70. So... Why is it surprising to play more than 60? The logic is usually you play a 60 card deck because it increases the odds of you finding the cards, like the best cards in your deck. In other words, Flaversham and Porpsicle. Every card you put in your deck that's over 60 card decreases the possibility of you drawing your best cards when you need them. And also, like, you could argue it like muddies the water in terms of synergy. Having said that, when you play cards like Vision of the Future, you have Flaversham, you're going to see a lot of your deck anyway. So it's definitely interesting. Like, Hamza's playing 2 dimes, which if you're playing 60 cards, most people are only playing 1. So that gives him something. Like, if he uses How Far I'll Go, he can put his lucky dime into the Inkwell, knowing that he has another in the deck, for example, right? So 2 Goofies are very interesting with Russian Evasive as a 5-5 that costs 6. That's going to be good in the mirror matchups to deal with a Half Shark. That's pretty spicy. Also deal with Diablo. The rest, there's nothing too crazy because obviously he's got 66 cards he can fit more in. There's a Hades in there, which is perhaps surprising over the Maleficent. But of course, you can Hades a little bit sooner. Cool decks, though, nonetheless. All right, we're going to do a bracket prediction. But first, let me look at my meta report that I shared. And let's talk about, did I do a good job? Well, Mufasa and Steel Locations, none of it made it. None of this made it either. So far, I think I've done a pretty good job. Then we get into here, and Blurple is the one I dropped the ball on. Interestingly, in the video, if you go back and watch it, I actually did say that I kind of wanted to put Blurple in the B tier, but it didn't really have the results to prove it. Maybe I just need to go with my gut. I think with the rest of it, honestly, I wish I just went with my gut a little bit more. I think this tier list would have been better if I went with my gut. I put Blurple in B tier, and I put Red Purple in B tier. Now, the obvious one that a lot of people are going to draw their attention to is that I put Ruby Sapphire in B tier, which they already did in the video. Have I changed my opinion? Honestly, not really. I really haven't. It's just like when I look at the meta spread, I just don't understand why people don't play quicker decks. So maybe it's because I like to play aggro that I think Ruby Sapphire is a B tier deck and it's impacted my opinion. I just think that Ruby Sapphire is so easy to beat 2-0. If you just build your, like, for me, I start my decks and I go, all right, I'm going to beat Ruby Sapphire 2-0 and then I'll worry about the rest afterwards. But perhaps that's a mistake because when you look at decks like Zax, for example, he's not gone for that approach, right? Zach's gone, all right, I'm going to accept I'm probably losing to Ruby Sapphire, but I'm good into everything else and I'm favored into everything else. And maybe that's why Ruby Sapphire should have gone into the A tier. I mean, Ruby Sapphire into the A tier was the obvious thing For me, I stick it in the B tier still. I put red purple in the B tier where it belongs. I put blurple into the B tier as well. So I think I did pretty good. I think I did pretty all right, honestly. Honestly, Zach's version of mid-range, I would put in the B tier. I think if you can't beat Ruby Sapphire and this one, Patrick's, this for me is a B tier deck. This I don't know. I just think it's just if you're losing to Ruby Sapphire 2-0 most of the time, when it's the most represented deck, I don't know if I can get behind it. But it is good into other things, so it's interesting. I think overall I did a pretty alright job. I think the blurple should have gone up. I think the red purple should have gone down. And okay, the Ruby Sapphire should have gone up. However, I still think Ruby Sapphire is only an A tier deck because people refuse to put Maleficent 1-drops in their deck. And they refuse to just build decks which consistently beat Ruby Sapphire. And instead they prefer to play decks which get beaten 2-0 by Ruby Sapphire. So I would say that Ruby Sapphire is an A tier deck because people don't like building decks to beat it. But I personally still put it in the B tier, but it probably is A tier. I think I did an alright job. I'm happy with it. Let's do our bracket predictions. Alright, so we've got Morgan versus Philippe. We will take a look at all the lists properly, but like Morgan's winning this. He's first seed and he's playing against Ruby Sapphire. Like, easy games. Easy games. Up next, we've got Joseph versus Zan. So this is going to be an interesting one. Zan obviously on the Emerald Steel. Oh, that's not Emerald Steel. Zan on Emerald Steel. And Morgan one of the... no, it's Joseph. That makes sense. I was like, Morgan. So Joseph is the highest seed in this one, and it's the Sapphire Amethyst deck, which has the McDuck Manners. And I think the McDuck Manners could cause Zan a pretty big problem, to be honest. And the other thing is that Joseph has is he can Elsa on 4. So that's pretty scary for Zan. I have a feeling that Joseph's going to come through this one, but I think it's going to be tight. I think this is one of the tougher ones to call. But I think with Joseph being the highest seed, with the fact that they have the Elsa on 4, like Genie on 3, Elsa on 4, and the McDuck Manners, I think it's going to be Joseph that takes this one home. But I think I could see Zan pulling it off. So I'm going to go for the first semi-final. Is this purple? It's not, is it? Purple. Very high production quality here. I'm going for purple, blue to take down Zan. 2-1. This is going to be a 2-0. All right, now, next up, we've got Ed versus RMB. This is a very, very fascinating one because it's the only Ruby Amethyst deck, of course. Ed's built his deck very, very differently, whereas RMB's Sapphire Amethyst is kind of built to win the purple mirrors. The thing is that Ed is decided to say, well, guess what? This is not your typical kind of purple mirror. I don't have the Genie. Whereas R&B's list is all about winning the Genie Wars, which is what another reason I just love Ed's list so much, right? R&B's list is saying, I'm going to win the Genie Wars, and that's what I'm focusing on. Because he doesn't have, for example, like the McDuck Manor, which is going to help against red-blue. Whereas Ed is saying, what Genie Wars? I'm going to give it to Ed. He's the highest seed. I think it could go either way. I think it's a really tough one to call. I think if Ed was playing a normal version of Ruby Sapphire with of Ruby Amethyst with Genies, I would give it to R&B despite being the lower seed. But I think the fact that Ed is not even bothering with the Genie Wars and has so many Tremaines and the libraries, I think I'm going to give it... I mean, 3 crabs, maybe the library's not that good. This is a matchup I would love to watch. I think that would be an awesome stream match. So I'm going to give it to Ed, but just about. That is a tough one to call. All right, so then obviously Hamza versus Pierre is a Ruby Sapphire mirror matchup. I'll give it to Hamza because he's going first twice. Let's do the quarterfinals and then go and the semi-final and then go and see the other side of the bracket. Morgan versus Joseph. So Sapphire Amethyst versus Amethyst Sapphire. I'm going to give it to Joseph. I think that Joseph having his deck to win the purple mirrors, I think that he's going to take it. So not red. I'm going to give it to the Sapphire Amethyst player. That's my thought. But to be fair, Morgan being a high seed, I think that Sapphire Amethyst really does have the edge there. So I'm going to give it to that. This one, I think we got to give to Ed, right? Like, Ed is still playing Ruby Amethyst, which is favored into Ruby Sapphire. He's got when going first, he's got the 1-drops, he's got the Flynn, he's got the library, which is going to be pretty damn good in that matchup. He's got 4 Tremaines. I'm giving it to Ed. I am giving it to Ed. So now what's interesting is into the semi-final that I'm predicting here, which is Ruby Amethyst versus Amethyst Sapphire. Who is the higher seed? I don't even know, like, necessarily if Ed will be the higher seed. That obviously could impact things, like, depending on who wins. I think he's the higher seed than both of those guys. I think Hamza is the 9th seed. If I'm not mistaken, let's have a look. I think Hamza's slightly below Ed in terms of... Oh, no, Hamza's actually a higher seed. So, if Hamza wins, like, the mirror matchup, Ed's going to struggle a bit more, but I think we've got to give it to Ed, right? Even if he's the lower seed, I think he's going to maybe be able to pull it off. So that one really depends on seeding, but I'm going to give it to Ed. So Sapphire Amethyst versus Ruby Amethyst. Joseph versus Ed. Who is the higher seed? Well, Ed is, it looks like, the 5th seed, and Joseph is the lower seed. So that makes it more of an interesting matchup. I think I'm going to give it to Ed. Let's look at the lists a little bit more closely. Of course, Ed again not playing that, not playing the Genie Wars at all. Who has a better late game? Is it like the extra ink of Sapphire, or is it Be Prepared? And I think the answer is Be Prepared. So I'm putting Ed in the final. I'm putting Ruby Amethyst, the only Ruby Amethyst deck, by the way, in the final. Ed in the final. That's my prediction. Let's look at the other side of the bracket. We've got Sean versus Zach. 2-0. The Ruby Sapphire. Sorry, Zach. I hope Zach pulls it off. Zach's going to be the lower seed. The next one's interesting. It's Kurt versus Patrick. Of course, a big advantage of playing a version of Amethyst Steel like this, more mid-rangey, less Maleficence, is you're going to have a better matchup into Amber Steel. He also has the Pete plus Fox, Pete plus Snake. Calhoun's pretty good in that matchup. But what is the exact list that Kurt's playing? It's a Diggy Diggy Hole one. I think it's the one with the Rapunzel Tower. Chempo. This is going to be an interesting matchup. I actually don't know who's favored in this one. Who's the higher seed? It's Kurt. I think I'm going to give it to Kurt. I don't think even with the like more mid-rangey approach of Amethyst Steel, it's that much of a good matchup. I think it's probably still a little bit awkward. I think Kurt might have the edge there, but I don't know for sure. This one could go either way. It really, really could. I think if Patrick goes through, mate, I kind of need to. I need to think about this one a bit longer. I think I've overcommitted. So Kurt is going first, but Patrick has 3 crabs, which makes the locations maybe not that good. Chempo, how do you deal with Chempo in this deck? Not very easily. That is a tough call. I think if it was the other side of the coin, if it was a higher seed for Patrick, I would put him through. But I'm going to put Kurt through. I'm going to stick with my guns there. I think it's Kurt's game. And then out of these two, Sean versus Kurt. What seed is Sean? Because that definitely has a big impact. Sean is top 8, whereas Kurt is higher seed. So I'm going to put the Diggy Diggy Hole deck winning that one. Possibly in 2-0 fashion. Possibly in 2-0 fashion. You might be surprised. Spessy isn't Amber Steel unfavored into Ruby Sapphire? No, not this version. It's favored, and it's the higher seed. So I think that one's a quite clear pick. I mean, I did say I still think Ruby Sapphire is a B-tier deck, by the way. I did still say that. I haven't predicted... I think the only matchup I predicted to win is the mirror. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the reality of it. Ruby Sapphire versus Amber Steel. Sean's Amber Steel is which one? Sean's Amber Steel is the Whole New World version. So I am, unfortunately for Sean, going to put Ruby Sapphire through. Ruby Sapphire winning this one. And then Justin versus Scott. Scott's the higher seed, but Justin has a Diggy Diggy Hole setup. So that's going to be interesting. Let's see. Diggy Diggy Hole, where art thou? Not that one. It's this one, isn't it? Yeah, Justin. So Justin versus Scott. Justin's the lowest seed. He has the Gantus. He has 4 Lilos. 4 Piglets. It is an aggressive setup. That's going to be an interesting match. Can Justin win going second once? That's what he needs to do. Probably he can. I think it's going to be a tight one. I think Gantu could put in some work. Let's look at Sean's list again. Scott's list, sorry. Scott has no Tremaines. I think that's a big deal for Gantu. I think Gantu is going to be a pretty big menace. This is, to me, the hardest one to predict, but I'm going to go ahead. I honestly, personally think Amber Steel might edge it. I think Amber Steel might edge it. Let me just make it a clearer blue because that looks kind of purple. I'm actually going to give it to Justin. Just about. Just about. I like the look of his list. I could be wrong. Even if I put Ruby Sapphire through, by the way, Kurt being a high seed, like, Kurt's in the finals, basically, I would say, is my prediction. So Ruby Sapphire versus Amber Steel again. This one, Justin versus Matthew. Justin's playing Diggy Diggy Hole. Who's the higher seed? That's going to be what I base this one on, maybe. Justin versus Matthew. Oh, Justin and Matthew. We'll get there eventually. It's going to be the last one I see, isn't it? So Matthew on Sapphire Steel. Does he have the Tremaine? He doesn't. He is the higher seed. I'm gonna say it's Amber Steel. I think the Amber Steel deck might just be able to get away with it. I think it's going to be tight. Either way, I think this prediction doesn't matter that much because this semi-final, I'm always giving to Kurt, I think. But I'm going to say Amber Steel's going to come through and there's no Ruby Sapphire in the semis. Which I think is controversial. I think there's a good chance that Ruby Sapphire makes it through from one of these. I really, really do. But I'm going to stick with my guns. And then I'm going to say it's obviously Amber Steel. But I'm going to say it's Kurt, specifically, that makes it through. So I'm predicting Ed versus Kurt final. And who's going to win? Ed or Kurt? I'm going to say it's Ed. I'm going to say Ruby Amethyst does it again. Final could, like, that final would be pretty interesting. Why do I think it's Ed? I just really like his deck. Kurt's going to be a higher seed if that's the final. I think there's a chance Kurt doesn't make it through as well, and I think that Ed's going to be well positioned to beat the Ruby Sapphire players. My prediction for the tournament win is Ed. I think he's one of the best players in the game. I think it's the best deck building I've seen in the tournament. And I think he has a pretty good run, potentially, but he might not even make it at all. But that's my prediction. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Really excited for the tournament. Let's see how well this ages. Obviously, you might be watching this after the fact, and you can see how my predictions did. But yeah, I've gone for Amethyst Emerald to beat Red Blue, then Purple Blue to beat Green Steel. That's a tough call. Then I've got Red Purple to beat Purple Blue. Then I've got obviously that one, and then Red Purple coming through it, and then a bit controversially, I've gone for Red Purple to beat Sapphire Purple. He's just not playing the Genie Wars. I really love Ed's deck, man. I think it's so damn cool. I'm a bit of a Ruby Amethyst hater as well, by the way. Like, again, I kind of wanted to put it in the B tier, but I've still predicted to win the whole tournament. But it's like Ed's deck is very, very different, right? Zach, I think, is just losing 2-0. I think this one's tough, but I think even if Patrick comes through this one, I think he's going to lose to Sean almost every single time. So I think that it's either Kurt or Sean making the semis. I could definitely see it being Sapphire Steel semifinals as well. Sorry, Ruby Sapphire semifinals. It's really hard with all these ink color names. That's why I've kind of switched to the red blue. But I think that Ruby Sapphire is my top other pick to make the finals here. Even though I went for Amber Steel Mirrors, I think Red Blue's got a really good chance of making it through the lower bracket here. Yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Give it a like if you did, and see you all very, very soon. Cheers. Thanks, Card Market.